Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today, and a big hello from me. I'll be your moderator for the session today. My name is David Hopwood. I'm a publisher at Elsevier, based in the UK, and I'd like to warmly welcome everyone to this Elsevier webinar, which aims to give some key insights into what is, I'm sure you'll agree, a hugely diverse topic of climate change. We've tried to break this down really into sort of two themes or two strands. So very shortly we'll be looking at where we stand 2 years after what many thought was a groundbreaking COP21 event in Paris, where much collaboration on reducing carbon emissions was achieved. And secondly, we'll switch tack a little bit and try to cover some scenarios and frameworks that really need to be in place to accelerate us along a path towards decarbonisation, and hence, hopefully, allowing us to fulfil some of those commitments agreed by countries at COP21. So a big thank you to everyone for joining us today. We do have a lot of people on the call, which is great because we've 3 excellent and amazingly well-qualified speakers today to discuss some of these issues. So many thanks in advance to them as well. Actually, the interest in this webinar today doesn't really surprise any of us. Climate change as a phrase is scarcely out of the headlines nowadays. And it's also timely that this webinar is taking place around a week or so following some really, really extreme weather events out in the US and Caribbean. Many scientists, although not all, of course, it has to be said, link the increased severity of such weather events to man-made climate change, so this is a very topical subject. I'd like to very briefly explain what we want you to get from this webinar today. So 2 years on from what was a very optimistic COP21 in Paris, I think it's fair to say that the general sense of where we are now is slightly less certain. And while there's still a lot to be positive about, especially looking at some renewable energy generating technologies which have become much cheaper in recent times. We also see a really different landscape with some new geopolitical challenges. One of these, of course, is the political change in the US. It is looking like the administration over there will try and peel back some of the US commitments agreed at the Paris meeting. So, confronting this challenge and other difficulties head on, how can we try and ensure that the Paris momentum isn't derailed in the drive to keep temperature rises below 2 degrees and preferably less than 1.5 degrees? And really, is it even still possible? Now, clearly, that's a very complex question. And what our speakers will do today is provide some really, really good context around these themes that you should be aware of. And in about an hour's time when we sign off, our aim is that you'll be right up to date with where we find ourselves post COP21, and also that you have a really good idea of what we need to be thinking about if we are to have any chance of meeting those targets agreed in Paris. So that's what our plan is today. We want this to be very interactive as well, so please do send us your questions. You can do that using the platform. And then following the presentations, in about 50 minutes from now, something like that, we'll have a little Q&A. And I'm hoping the speakers will be able to stick around for that as well. We'll see how many questions we can get to. Good. So I'm going to stop waffling now. I want to introduce our first speaker today, who is really going to get right to the heart of the subject matter. We're really, really fortunate to have Alice Larkin with us today from the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research. And what Alice is going to do is quantify exactly what the scale of the challenge is, as you see from the first slide on the screen, both in terms of the Paris Agreement, but I believe she'll also focus on some key areas that we really need to focus on as well. A few words about Alice. Alice trained as an astrophysicist at the University of Leeds, did her PhD in climate modelling at Imperial College, then moved on to work in science communication. She returned to academia in 2003, joining the interdisciplinary Tyndall Centre to research conflicts between climate change and aviation, and she actually became director of Tyndall Manchester between 2013 and 2016. She's now the lead Manchester investigator on a large consortium project funded by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council entitled Shipping in Changing Climates. She's also a principal investigator on a large EPSRC consortium project on the water, food, energy nexus, which is another really, really interesting theme. And she's also a co-investigator on the UK Energy Research Centre project, RACER. So a huge welcome, Alice. Thank you for being here. Over to you. The presenter's deck is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about the scale of the Paris Challenge and actually try to connect the global scale of this problem to the local and to look at some of the key aspects in between. So in terms of the outline of the presentation, I'm going to focus first on the global policy objective post-Paris, the current emissions and scale of the challenge, just in very brief sort of graphical format, not going into a huge amount of detail on the quantification. And then 3 challenges that I'd like to focus on. One around negative emission technologies, another around international aviation and shipping CO2 emissions, and the other on connecting this global and local action around Paris, and then draw some conclusions. So we're all familiar with the fact that we had a big agreement in Paris in 2015, and I would argue that Paris presented us with a new global goal, because although we'd been talking about avoiding 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels for many years, the Paris Agreement spelt out that it needed to be well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and indeed also keeping in mind 1.5 degrees of warming. Now, this is significant because this is more ambitious than had been previously discussed, because if you think about it, well below 2 degrees implies a good probability of avoiding that 2-degree target, which is indicative of the amount of emissions that we can have in our atmosphere in order to avoid such a temperature rise. So if you have a low probability of avoiding 2 degrees, you have more space, you have more emissions to play with. If you have a high probability of staying within that goal, then there's very limited amount of CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases that can be produced. It also tells us that we need to make sure that we are in keeping with the best science, and that we need to take into consideration and consider equity. And again, this is important, particularly when we're trying to link the global to local, because we have to consider what other countries around the world are able to deliver in terms of the amount of CO2 emission reduction that might be necessary. And so equity and justice are key themes, even for physical scientists and engineers to consider when looking at this problem of climate change. So here we have a presentation, we have a slide here of the CO2 emissions going up the left-hand side of the graph, and then you've got the time along the bottom from 1990 out to 2050. Now on this graph, there's a pink line there, which is the historical emissions of carbon dioxide that are produced by fossil fuels and industrial emissions, going up there steadily. You see a small dip around 2008, and that was connected with the economic recession or economic downturn globally. And then you'll see the red trajectory there, which indicates where emissions would, if they continued along that trajectory, then that would be associated with around a 4-degree temperature rise. And then the green trajectory there showing that if we wanted to avoid a 2-degree rise, then in a very short space of time, we would have to make sure that those emissions reached a peak and started to reduce very rapidly. If we look at what came out of Paris, in Paris, countries signed up to deliver what they called nationally determined contributions. So in other words, each country said how much they would be able to reduce their emissions by in future. Now, because this has been done on a country-by-country basis, when you add these up, unfortunately, they don't add up to avoiding this 2-degree temperature goal. Rather, they fall somewhere between the 2 degrees and the 4-degree trajectories. Some of these determined contributions don't go past 2030, or almost all of them don't go past 2030, so assumptions have to be made after that time. But basically, they don't add up to where we need to be. So we need to be more ambitious than is already being laid out, and we know that, and that is common knowledge. But what's key about this graph, and just a point to get across, is that it's actually the area under this curve that's really important. We have a fixed carbon budget for a certain temperature rise. So if we don't tackle emissions in the near term, then because it's the area under this curve that matters, you'd have to reduce your emissions even more later on to make sure that that area under the curve stays the same. And I'll just illustrate this again with another graph. So if you imagine we've got, again, the CO2 emissions at the left-hand side and time along the bottom. If you imagine that we want to follow the green line there, the green dotted line, but in actual fact we follow the red line and we start to have emissions going up a little bit higher than we wanted because perhaps our policies that we've put in place aren't bringing down emissions quickly enough. Now, whatever we do overshoot our target by in the early years in terms of that shaded red area under the curve needs to be compensated for later in order to have the same outcome in terms of the temperature rise. So this gives us a few policy pointers. So one of them is that if we focus too much on the very long term, then that might mean that we don't do enough in the short term to actually meet our climate target. And in other words, our 2050 target might actually change depending on how well we do in the near term. It also means that if we don't reduce emissions in the near term, that the trajectory will need to become steeper. That's important because it might be the case that the policies and the measures and looking at how we change our energy system, the things that we put in place might not be able to reduce emissions annually at a very steep rate. So the more that we can do in the near term, the better. So how can we make these mitigation trajectories be a bit more manageable or perhaps appear a bit more manageable? Now, this is a topic area that is causing considerable debate within the climate change community at present. So one of the things that has happened when we've been modelling how do we avoid a 2-degree target and what does the outcome of that look like is we use lots of scenarios. Now, in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Scenario Database, so this is a database of lots of different possibilities for avoiding the 2-degree target, 400 scenarios for a 50-50 chance of avoiding 2 degrees, so arguably not a well below 2 degrees, but a 50-50 chance. Of these, about 86% of them include large-scale negative emissions. So in other words, they assume negative emission technologies, which I'll say a little word about in a second for those of you who aren't familiar with those. The remaining 14% assumed global emissions actually peaked or reached a peak in 2010, which they didn't. They continue to rise. And therefore, most of them use both negative emissions and peak in the past in order to avoid the 2-degree target. So what does that all mean when we come back to our cumulative emissions or our area under the curve graph? Well, what it means is if we can assume that emissions can actually go below zero sometime out into the future, so in other words, we're using technologies and measures to actually take CO2 out of the atmosphere, then that means, again, looking at the area under the curve, that we can start to reduce our emissions a little later, so it takes a bit of the pressure off. And also it means, well, we would have to go below zero. However, there are some concerns over the implications of this in terms of what the message is that comes out of the science, but also the realism of actually being able to deliver something that can take emissions that go well below zero. So just a brief word on negative emission technologies. How do they work? Well, we grow trees or plants. They absorb CO2 through photosynthesis, but then we would burn this biomass in power stations. We need to then capture the CO2 from the chimney of those power stations, liquefy the CO2 and pump that underground, and store that for many thousands of years. So this is a huge task in terms of the technology. This is not to say that this isn't possible at a small scale, and certainly it's being tried and tested, but the scale that is being assumed in the models is vast. And there is a debate on this, and there's work out there discussing this. So some of the challenges, it's never worked at scale. There are huge technical and economic unknowns, particularly when we're talking about large-scale land use change. There's a major efficiency penalty within the thermal power stations. There's limited biomass availability, brings us back to a food fuel debate that many of you will be aware of. And also we have poorly understood feedback. So, one of the complications and uncertainty in climate science in general is the feedbacks. And again, we don't fully understand what the implications of these would be. So I would argue that relying on either time travel, so assuming emissions peaked in the past, or future uncertain technologies, prioritizes longer-term solutions, so putting off the mitigation effort, over changes that could be made in the short term. And I think that this is a problem. So that's my word on that. I'll come back to that at the very end. A second issue I just want to highlight in terms of the Paris Agreement is the issue around aviation and shipping. So I'm saying here, is anything else important missing? And I would say the answer to this is yes. The CO2 emissions from international aviation and shipping are a key part of global CO2 emissions. But they're no individual country's responsibility. So because they happen in international airspace and international waters, when countries have pledged to reduce emissions by a particular level, they do not include international aviation and shipping. Yet when you look at aviation and shipping as a whole, their total CO2 emissions is more than all of South America's, about 4 to 5% of global CO2 emissions. So this is not an insignificant amount. This is a very large amount that we are not controlling or considering at the moment with significant mitigation measures of the type that are affecting other sectors. It's also the case that both of these sectors anticipate that their CO2 emissions are likely to grow in future because of their activity around economic growth, supporting trade, particularly within developing and industrializing nations, and again, the activity between more flying between wealthier nations and poorer nations is still on the rise. So we don't have the technologies to significantly mitigate in a very short space of time, particularly around aviation. So we must account for this when we are developing these national determined contributions. Otherwise, we're missing out quite an important part of the jigsaw. And finally, a third question I have would be, are there any other major challenges to deployment of the mitigation effort? So, in other words, we've pledged to reduce emissions by a certain amount, but how do we know that we are going to be able to achieve that? What in reality is happening? How do they actually get delivered in terms of on-the-ground action? Well, the reality of NDCs is that many national governments will devolve the responsibility for those actions down to regions, councils, cities, and so on and so forth. And those councils, those regional development agencies, whatever they may be in different countries, will have many other local needs that they need to address. And they will need to, therefore, deploy these big changes to energy systems, to transport systems, to housing, and so on and so forth, whilst also considering some of the other great pressures that many of those cities and regions will face. And of course, these are very different depending on where you are in the world. Now, there may be some potential synergies. There will also be some potential trade-offs. But in terms of synergies and trying to look for opportunities, things like improving people's health whilst tackling hard-to-heat homes with technologies that reduce CO2 emissions, or insulating better so we don't have to heat or cool homes as much as we do currently, and that could have tremendous health benefits as well. If we have a very large rollout of electric vehicles, for example, within cities, within regions, then there will be air quality benefits that go alongside that, so we will be hitting both of those at the same time. And again, if we're going to be helping to generate local energy supplies, perhaps the money from those energy activities could be reinvested in other local services. But the key thing is that the Paris ambition, the scale of this is huge and it requires urgency. So we need to get better at joining up some of these competing, sometimes synergistic needs at the local level in order that we can actually deliver on the kinds of ambition that we've pledged as nations and actually also take it a step further and bring it more in line with the 2-degree target. So just to draw conclusions, delivering on the Paris Agreement requires an unprecedented challenge to all of us. It's essential that we scope options that don't just include large-scale negative emission technologies. It may be the case that we need to look a lot more, and this is my view, that we need to look a lot more at the demand side, at our behaviour, at our actions in the short to medium term, particularly those of us in wealthy nations, and not assume that some of these technologies that we don't know are going to operate well at scale are going to deliver. Aviation and shipping are what I would class as a big emitter, similar to some of the other big nations that are emitting CO2, and we must account for their emissions when considering delivering on the Paris Agreement. Plausible scenarios, therefore, for international transport are really needed urgently. We need to really be thinking about what we're using aviation and shipping for, where are their emissions likely to be in the future, and how does that all add up in the mitigation context. Delivering the Paris Agreement NDCs is going to be done locally in many countries. So we need to make sure that we understand what the competing pressures are and work with local governments and local decision makers to ensure that we can build on the synergies but also emphasise the urgency of delivering on the Paris Agreement, particularly in the mitigation side of things in wealthy countries. So it requires strong ambition if there are synergies with local needs. And finally, we need to act and look local to global. As long as we do that, then the global view is complete. But if we don't connect the two, then we might be missing a trick. Thank you.
That's great, Alice. Thank you very much. Really, really interesting, and already awful lot to think about there, especially on aviation and shipping. I think if there's a few things that people take away from today, I think really trying to look into that area, aviation, shipping, I think sounds like it should be something that action is needed on. So thank you very much for that. It's also really interesting to hear about some of these negative emissions technologies. I was actually speaking to somebody fairly recently about something called BECCS, which I think you were mentioning. That was the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage.
That's right.
I think one of our journals here at Elsevier is going to be doing some kind of special issue on that at some stage. So maybe we can have a chat about that. Anyway, on that note, and continuing to look at some ways to reduce carbon, our next speaker, Roland Rusch from IRENA, is going to talk more about that institution's work promoting renewables, which, as we know, are crucial in the effort to decarbonise the power sector. And he'll also talk about the importance of technology innovation, and hopefully give some context on some microscale development as well, with an example of islands transitioning to renewable energy. So a quick introduction to Roland then. Roland Rusch is a Senior Programme Officer, Renewable Energy Markets and Technology Dialogue at the International Renewable Energy Agency, or IRENA. Prior to becoming a Professor for Energy Economics, he worked for 15 years in the oil and gas and utilities industry as General Manager Power at Shell and Head of Division at E.ON. And preceding that, he worked as a consultant for Larmire International. He currently leads the IRENA Renewable Energy Project Development Guideline Initiative, known as Project Navigator, and IRENA's work related to renewable energy technology, innovation, and grids and storage. So, a great welcome to you, Roland, as our speaker number 2. Over to you. The presenter's deck is now yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the introduction, Dave. I'm happy to speak here on behalf of IRENA in the Elsevier webinar, Climate Change 2 years on from COP21, where we are and now where we should go from here. I have to see with the presentation my first slide. Second. I think my slide is not there yet. I would like to present on behalf of IRENA, IRENA's work on innovation. But first I would like to give an overview of IRENA and who IRENA is, the International Renewable Energy Agency. I would like then to present what we have done in the past 5 years on innovation for renewable energy innovation. Also very important for the implementation and to mitigate and decarbonize the economy is IRENA's work on project facilitation. And then I would like to speak about one leading initiatives of IRENA, the Islands and Small Island Development States Lighthouse Initiative. First, IRENA We are the International Renewable Energy Agency. Our mandate is to promote the widespread adoption and sustainable use of all forms of renewable energy worldwide. The objective of the agency is to serve as a network hub, an advisory resource, and an authoritative, unified global voice for renewable energies. Our scope are all renewable energy sources produced in a sustainable manner. Let's say the renewable energy sources we look at the moment is bioenergy, geothermal, hydropower, ocean energy, solar energy, and wind energy. The mandate also of IRENA is then to assist countries to accelerate renewable energy deployment. I'm very proud to say that we as of now have 152 member countries as full membership to IRENA, and we have another 28 states in accession to IRENA, which almost completes our global membership, which let's say with 193 countries worldwide. So we are almost have a complete global membership of IRENA, which of course strengthens a lot our mandate. Very important for IRENA is the work we are doing in the area of innovation for decarbonization. We recently did a study on behalf of G20. So G20 asked us to carry out a study in how to decarbonize the global economy. And let's say from this study, the results are renewables are crucial for the decarbonization of the energy sector. In the energy sector, renewables would account to 58% of total reductions in CO2 emissions till 2050. So this is very relevant. Additional 32% would come from improvement in energy efficiency. So altogether, 90% of the total global emission reductions would have to come, let's say, from energy efficiency and renewable energy together. So this is a very strong statement. But on the other hand, there is a business case for renewables in the power sector. So that the business is already taking off. Renewable energies are competitive to fossil fuel driven ways of generating power. So the business case for renewables in the power sector is strong. The reduction potential in the power sector is more than 11 gigatons of CO2 emission per year. And I think the very important part is here that would be available at zero mitigation costs. So there is a strong business case to deploy renewable energies also to achieve climate goals. Innovations, let's say innovations have shown in the past so that in the area of renewable energies, the costs have been very strongly already substantially reduced. So about 80% have the cost of solar PV been reduced. And let's say in the area of wind turbines, cost reduction of 40% were possible in the past years. So, but there is more innovation needed, as you can see on this slide. And let's say just to mention here, and we know this from several expert discussions we had, also during the IRENA Innovation Week, we know that renewable energy technologies and also enabling technologies to integrate renewable energies in the existing energy systems are already by now available, but there is a lot more work and innovation needed in the next stage of system integration of variable renewables to integrate and to improve the innovations on integrating renewables. Also, it was mentioned by the Tyndall Center in the last presentation, there are more technical breakthroughs needed in the end-use sector. So shipping, road transport, and aviation was already mentioned. and there is a need also in the area of heavy industries to create more innovative breakthroughs. IRENA is very closely working together with the governments of its member countries, and let's say not only technology innovation plays a role here, especially systemic innovation is needed for the renewable power sector. I already mentioned that generation technologies and enabling infrastructure for renewable energies is in place. But let's say the utilities and the operators are looking already into new ways to operate the energy system, which are different ways of operating the energy system in a different way as it was done in a more carbon-driven economy. And let's say to create and monetize the values that are coming from these new ways of operating the system have to come by policymakers and by market regulators. So our first level of discussion, our stakeholders are policymakers worldwide, and we help to achieve policy objectives while intensifying the investment. And that helps to create business models so that the private sector can create business models with support of policymakers and market regulators, which create and enable revenues and revenue streams for the new technologies, which enable them to take further investments into the energy sector transformation and to do more innovation related to generation technologies and into the enabling infrastructure. And let's say this is an approach, we call it a systemic innovation approach, which basically doesn't look only on technologies, it combines technology innovation with market innovation, market design, market regulation, and also with the creation of new business models. The next slide. So what we have done, IRENA has created a platform, a stakeholder platform to support the energy sector transformation in member countries. In 2016, we had our first IRENA Bonn Innovation Week, where we invited about 200 experts from the public sector and policymakers, but also innovators from the private sector, with having leading innovators in the industries on board to discuss the challenges for the energy sector transformation. Based on the outcome of the Innovation Week, we have several other engagements, like with several innovation days in member countries, but we also engage now with the European Utility Week in Amsterdam in 2 weeks, and many other engagements where we bring together opinions and views of the public sector, of policymakers, and also of the private sector to make sure that we create the necessary innovations in the area of sector transformation. And I would like to invite everybody to be engaged and to share opinions and views with us in this discussion. My next part of the presentation is related to the IRENA work on project facilitation. So the next challenge is that member countries of IRENA, they are aware that renewable energy resources are available everywhere, know about the potential for renewable energies, they know about the low costs and the competitiveness of renewable energies, but there is a difficulty to prepare bankable proposals to bring a project from the idea to implementation and get financing for the implementation of projects. And there we have the project facilitation tools from IRENA. We have the Global Atlas, which helps to make an initial assessment of the resources for renewable energies on specific sites. We have the Project Navigator to develop bankable proposals, and we have two ways to support the financing of renewable energy projects on the ground globally. This is the Sustainable Energy Marketplace, a matchmaking platform that matchmakes projects, idea, and investors. And then we have the support of the IRENA Abu Dhabi for Development that helps to finance, especially in, let's say, more complex, risky environments, renewable energy projects globally. Very important is to say that the bankability is very important to get the funds from the World Bank and other multinational and national development banks. And with the IRENA Project Navigator, we have, let's say, a very good tool that helps already 5,000 users worldwide to develop renewable energy projects. The objectives here are strengthening the project development base, enhancing the quality of project proposal, and then also reducing the costs and mitigating risks through proper planning and efficient use of funds. So here is a very clear, good tool to help. And there you see on the next slide, I think I have to recover the web page. Maybe we can go further by hand. The next slide is about the stepwise approach. So it's slide number 10. So in slide number 10, please, you can see that there is in the Project Navigator that you can reach under w.irena.org/navigator. You will find a process from identification to financial closing. And the Project Navigator includes a learning section where you can learn about the requirements of the banks and what needs to be done to develop a renewable energy project. But we have also started a project section with tools and models and financial models and checklists to develop your own projects. Last but not least, we have basically a research database to find out what kind of renewable energy funds globally available to fund your renewable energy projects.
Sorry, Roland. Sorry to interrupt, Roland. 2 minutes, is that okay?
Yes, it's okay.
Brilliant. Thank you.
The thing is, let's say I cannot access my slides anymore. I would like to say a few words on IRENA's island energy transition work. So there is a strong case for small island development states and other islands to transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And let's say there is the Lighthouse Initiative offers a framework for small island development states to move away from piecemeal deployment of structured, holistic, sustainable approach of renewables, taking medium and long-term needs and impacts into account. All elements are taken into consideration from policy and market frameworks through technology options, project development and financing to capacity building to ensure sustainability. Programmatic steps for accelerated deployment of renewables are defined and opportunities for partnerships are highlighted. Please go to my last slide. I would like to say what IRENA supports with the Renewable Energy Lighthouse Initiative. The Lighthouse Initiative offers a framework for small island development states to move from developing projects in isolation to a holistic approach that considers long-term needs and covers all elements required for a successful transition to renewables. Within the initial 5-year time frame, so up to 2020, the Lighthouse Initiative will focus on the power sector with the aim to achieve the following. mobilize $500 million for small island development states, deploy 100 megawatt of new solar PV, and deploy 20 megawatt of new wind power on small island development states. Also, deployment of significant quantities of small hydropower and geothermal energy and some marine projects is supported by IRENA, and this will ensure the participating SIDs have renewable energy roadmaps in place. And let's say we have a lot of tools that we use to support the islands in their endeavor to do the energy sector transformation on the islands. Thanks for listening to my presentation.
That's great, Roland. Thank you very much for that. Some great information there. I do know that IRENA has made a real difference actually since its inception. It's doing some really good work with renewables and some of these micro communities as well. So I'd encourage everyone to have a look at IRENA and see what they're up to. Okay, let's move on because I want to make sure we do have some time for questions at the end. So I guess we're going to switch gears a little bit now and talk about the importance of policy development in helping countries deliver on climate change agendas. And again, we'll be thinking of renewables as the decarbonisation angle. But our final speaker, Jenny Heater, is from the US. She works as a policy analyst at NREL, one of the key government-funded agencies in the US. So she's in a fantastic position to give some real insights into policies that can stimulate energy transitions. But also I think she'll be able to comment on deploying technologies outside of federal mandates as well, which some US states may find themselves having to do increasingly more of over the next few years, I would guess. So she'll touch briefly on policy mechanisms worldwide, but then really focus in on renewables implementation, but using the US as a pretty timely case study. So I'd like to introduce her, Jenny Heater. As I said, she's a senior energy analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, in Colorado. She holds an MPA in Environmental Policy from Indiana University Bloomington's School of Public and Environmental Affairs, and a BA in Environmental Studies and Political Science from, and I'll probably say this wrong, but Macalester College. She focuses her research on state renewable portfolio standards, corporate purchases of renewable energy, and the mid-scale solar market. So a really broad view of policy from many different perspectives. Have to say in advance, we've had a little bit of a hiccup with the slides, which are actually not labelled correctly. So apologies to Jenny for that, but we'll get that fixed for the on-demand version of these. So over to you, Jenny. Thanks for being here. Big welcome. The presenter's deck is yours.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. Again, as David mentioned, I'll be talking about policies and corporate support for renewable energy. So I first wanted to run through some of the topics I'll be covering, just fundamentally policies that do support renewable development internationally. I want to focus in on the U.S., looking at how state, local, and corporate commitments to renewable energy have been increasing, and then look at what has the progress to date been in meeting commitments and policy targets in the U.S. So first, just for some background on policies, and I apologize, the slide did not translate very well, but looking at what we call conventional policies to support renewable energy. I want to walk through each of these mechanisms in a little bit of detail to help understand, where things have been traditionally with incentivizing renewables. So the first policy instrument is tendering or reverse auctions. And this can be used by a utility to put out a call for renewable energy generation. They may say that, we want 50 megawatts of renewables, and then developers will bid in at their lowest cost, and the utility will select the lowest cost bid. Feed-in tariffs are more common internationally than in the U.S., but I do want to highlight them. They're basically giving a long-term contract to renewable producers and also guaranteed interconnection. So some of the challenges with feed-in tariffs revolve around what price do you set that tariff? Should it decline over time, and if so, how? And how can you provide some assurance to developers that they will get some sort of feed-in tariff in the future? Third policy is net metering or net billing, which is quite common in the U.S. This is used for behind-the-meter renewable generation, where it allows you to essentially get credit for renewables that are produced on your utility bill. And that credit is usually based on the retail rate of electricity paid, although there has been quite a bit of pushback by utilities in the U.S. to change that compensation rate. The fourth policy I wanted to talk through was RPS's Renewable Portfolio Standards, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And I think somebody needs to be on mute as well, maybe one of our speakers. So renewable portfolio standards are requirements or quotas that a utility or some other entity will be required to procure or generate themselves a set amount of renewable electricity. And I'll talk more about that in the U.S. examples later on. And then finally, some state, local, national governments provide tax incentives for various types of renewable generation, and those tax incentives can be applied typically through the developer. So when we look internationally at the types of policies that countries are adopting, this data is from REN 21, which does a great job compiling all of the renewable policies internationally. The policies in blue are related to the power sector. So these are things like feed-in tariffs, net metering, renewable portfolio standards that I just mentioned. We do see that there have been more countries over time adopting these types of policies related to power sector renewables. The most common types of policies in the power sector for renewables are those feed-in tariffs or premium payment policies in that light blue shaded bar. So we do see a lot of countries that are, setting some sort of premium for renewable generation. When we think about, what's happening with the transition to renewables, we also want to consider what policies might be needed to support next generation levels of renewables, and just how can these fundamental or conventional policies be modified to provide more benefits in a changing dynamics. So the first is looking at how do you minimize grid impacts while securing renewables? So can renewables be sited in areas that might be more favorable for the grid? For example, if there is an area where more generation is needed, can renewables fill that gap? So looking at where do we site renewables and making sure they're sited most appropriately. The second next generation policy type or principle is really looking at this balance between policy certainty and policy flexibility. So for renewable generators, they are typically looking for policy certainty. They want to know that if they're getting an incentive or having some sort of subsidy, that subsidy is known for the life of the renewable generator. But we do know that because renewable costs are coming down quite dramatically, there is some need for some policy flexibility and modifying policies over time. So that's a tension that can be grappled with at the state and local level and national level. The third principle is looking at how do price support mechanisms interact with wholesale markets. We've seen this happen in the United States. For example, there is a production tax credit that wind generators get for every megawatt hour that they produce, which allows them essentially to bid into wholesale markets bidding at zero because they know that they will still get that production tax credit, even though they may be getting $0 from their wholesale market sale. So that distortion effect can be significant and is something that should be considered when developing these types of price support and market features. The fourth principle to consider is just complexity. So a lot of policies in the U.S. have been developed at the state level, and states want to innovate and do something that is very specific to their state and to their market. However, that can be difficult for renewable developers to understand policies that may be too complex and trying to do too many things all at once. The fifth principle is looking at whether we should incentivize specific technology types or capabilities. So for an example of that, you could consider, should a policy incentivize storage, or should it incentivize products that can provide different capabilities to the grid without specifying that individual technology type? The sixth principle is looking at cost containment or market responsive provisions. In the U.S., we did have some examples of states where they would mandate solar deployment, and there may not, the market may not be able to support low-cost solar deployment. So the prices for that solar policy ended up being quite high. But there are ways that you could cap that total cost or provide some market responsive provisions. And then lastly, we're looking at how to determine who should pay for these policies, how should those costs be construed, so that it might be only a tax-funded measure, so coming from the entire tax base, or it could be a policy that's funded through ratepayer funds that flow through the utility. So the next piece on the policy side I want to talk through is how can policies support corporate procurement of renewables? And this is based on a paper that NREL led this last year for the Clean Energy Ministerial, which is a group of energy ministers from around the world. And they had an initiative looking at what policies are needed essentially to allow corporate institutions, so Apple, Google, Microsoft, as well as bigger players like Walmart in the retail space, what policies are needed for them to buy renewable energy, because a lot of these corporates, as I talk through later, are looking to green their supply chains. They're looking to green their total energy consumption. And they have a lot of loads internationally. So they may be U.S.-based corporations, but they are, sourcing from international companies. They are, having data centers all across the world, things like that. So we did a deep dive into the policies across the top and looked at, this is for off-site renewable procurement, but what types of policies are needed and what's sort of the existing landscape here. So I won't go through this in detail, but just to say that these policies are definitely needed, and they're still starting to emerge, and there's a lot of work to be done here. So the next piece, looks like it's a little slow to load, but I wanted to talk about what's happening in the U.S. In reaction to the U.S. indication that we would withdraw from the Paris Agreement. The three agreements on the left, the U.S. Climate Alliance and Climate Mayors, all launched in June and the later part of June in 2017. And these are all commitments that are being made by organizations, so corporate businesses, as well as cities and counties at the mayor level, as well as the state level, basically saying, to one degree or another, we are still committed to meeting carbon targets and climate change targets. In addition to those three groups that launched this summer, there have been some initiatives for 100% renewable energy, so the RE100 campaign, is focused at the corporate level and has a very significant international audience. Sierra Club is running a Ready for 100 campaign in the United States focused at the local government level. So these efforts are really ramping up in the U.S. To help private sector folks meet renewable and climate targets. At the state level, in recent years, we've seen a lot of increases in our state RPSs. So the states in dark green have increased their RPS targets to 50% or above, and they have different end-year targets. But just to say that the state landscape as well is changing pretty rapidly as renewable costs come down. NREL and our partner lab, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, have done research over the past couple years looking at renewable portfolio standards and what are the costs and benefits of those types of policies. So last year we authored this study looking at existing RPSs on the left there in blue and a high RPS scenario on the right in green. We modeled using a lot of NREL's electricity modeling capabilities, the electric system costs of those policies. We also looked at a number of benefits. The ones that could be quantified here are the greenhouse gas reduction benefits and the air pollution and health benefits. And then we also looked at natural gas consumer benefits. So from our work, there was quite a bit of uncertainty in some of the benefits calculation, but you can see that essentially the benefits that we could quantify, even just limiting it to those, heavily outweigh the electric system. And this is some work that we've done over the past couple years to help state folks understand, what are the impacts of these policies as they make larger commitments. So I just wanted to conclude with a few pieces on where the U.S. is in terms of deploying renewables through these state policies. What we call the voluntary market, those corporate buyers and others that are buying renewables of their own accord. So this is data from going through 2015. We're looking at the voluntary market in green there, which is about a quarter of the renewables market in the U.S. So the lighter two blue shades there are the compliance markets, the RPS markets, and then we have a little bit of renewables just being met through utility procurement. On the corporate side of procurement, we just did a paper looking at how corporations are trying to do off-site solar. So we do see some of the leading companies are those IT companies. It's Apple, Amazon, Switch, which is a data center provider. But we also have some of our state and federal government agencies being being on the list as well. And just to conclude, this is a map of off-site solar procurement across the U.S., which is, we look at, which states have the most favorable environments, which are indicated by the level of corporate procurement, so the megawatt hours there in the circles. And then overlaid under that is the LCOE of utility scale solar. So what we find by looking at this map is that some of our areas with very low cost solar, so the desert Southwest primarily, don't have the right policies in place to support corporate procurement. So we can see that there's more work needed there to support corporations who want to buy off-site solar but don't have a policy mechanism to do so right now. So I will conclude there, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes for questions, but these are some of our recent papers as well as my contact information. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Great presentation. Apologies to everyone. I think there may be one or two little gremlins on the line. So if you're hearing any feedback or strange noises, then please accept our apologies for that. A big thank you to all our speakers today. I'm sure you'll agree that there's an awful lot of information there, a lot of thought-provoking stuff. So thank you very much. I'm looking at the time. It is quite late, and I don't want to keep people for too long. So what I'm going to suggest, we have had quite a few questions in, as you would probably think that would be the case. I am going to suggest that we try and get speakers to answer these offline, and then we'll find some way of sharing them with the audience today. What I would like to do before we finish is just ask one question to all of the three speakers, because this is something that I think would provide a sort of nice conclusion. So in terms of research into climate change, if you could think of just 2 or 3 areas that you've come across that you feel are really, really fundamental or key to addressing climate change, it would be really good to get your perspectives on that. And that can be, research in academia or applied research, or any research that you've seen that's really excited you. So if we could have each of our speakers to give their perspectives on that before we finish, that would be good. So shall we start with Alice, maybe?
Okay, yeah. I think I alluded to this a little bit in my presentation. Whilst I have a physics background myself and I've done climate modelling, I worry that we focus so much on the quantitative modelling and the future technologies that we really take our eye off the research area on the demand side, not just in terms of the sort of efficient technologies that perhaps we should be developing on the demand side, but actually how we use energy, how we behave, what we do in our daily lives, and how that could be reconfigured in a way that is much more low carbon for those of us in rich countries where our carbon per person is very high. So a real focus of bringing in the social sciences, really interdisciplinary type research, where it isn't just dominated by the physical quantification, but how can we actually engage people to the extent that we realise that our whole system needs to change, and how can we do that?
Great answer. Thanks, Alice. Roland, what's your take on that one?
I think I also said already in my presentation that technologies for the energy sector transformation, or also enabling technologies and also renewable energy technologies are already available. But let's say there are more innovations needed in enabling technologies to integrate and to come to higher shares of renewables needed, especially from 2030 onwards, when we reach levels of renewables, let's say with 30-50% and even higher, more enabling technologies like smart grids, storage, also sector coupling innovation is needed. This is a very, very important part. And then it's not only about the technologies, it's also about market design, policy innovation in regulation will have a very big impact to set the business models to get the energy sector transformation and the decarbonizing of the economy done. Also, I think it was mentioned in several of the presentations that, let's say, in the power sector, already a lot has been achieved. So the cost went down, renewable energies are competitive with fossil fuels, and they are even more cost efficient. And let's say now we have also to look at the other sectors. So the transport sector, the industry sector, also the building sector, to reduce the CO2 emissions and other emissions in these areas. And there the costs are still higher, so there innovation is needed to bring down the costs to unlock also the potential in the sectors that are, let's say, exist beyond the energy sector. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Roland. Finally, Jenny, your take, I guess, from the policy side on good research you've seen that could make a difference.
Yep. I would echo some of Roland's comments about grid integration and pathways to high renewable energy use. A lot of our policymakers at the state level in the U.S. are beginning to set these high renewable energy targets without having done a lot of the rigorous modeling to understand how they may get there. So some of that work is still needing to be done. NREL has done quite a bit of work modeling high penetration renewable scenarios under using our large-scale models. So we've looked at the U.S. interconnection, Eastern interconnection, and things like that. But a lot of that specific state policy research has yet to be completed. And then the second piece I would just emphasize is that as the costs of storage come down, a lot of policy research is still needed to understand how storage may interact with our existing renewable energy mandates, how it can help support those mandates, both on the wholesale and the retail side.
Okay, fantastic. That's really good. Well, thank you very much, everyone. We have run a good 5 minutes over time now, so I'm going to have to wrap things up there. But please rest assured we will get some of these questions that you've sent in answered, and it will also give us a really good opportunity to sort of continue the dialogue as well. So thanks so much for your attendance. A huge thank you to the speakers. Sorry for the gremlins. Don't forget there will be a recording of this webinar that will be online shortly, and we'll follow up with you and let you know where you can view it. In the meantime, thank you everyone. Great to be here today, and we'll say goodbye for now. The webinar is now ending. Thank you.